say that just going to give you a broad sense of what we've done today. I think about 6 months ago, we started some study groups about once a week in addition to everything else we were doing. Really that was created, the impetus was the statute that provided all of these opportunities. So in many of these areas we would come back week after week and go chew on the questions and try to find answers and talk to some of you around the country. And it's been a really exciting opportunity to kind of step back from the normal day-to-day, the normal application process, the normal renewal process, and think about a different kind of structure that could effectively achieve our goals. So to start with, replication in many respects is nothing new to us at SUNY. We have been replicating schools for quite some time, and now 34% of our portfolio are replicators of some way, shape, or form, whether they be an individual school looking to start one more, schools to grow. I think our largest network is Uncommon at over a dozen schools. So we have all kinds of varieties and flavors of replications, which I think is important to take into account. We have, as Ralph said, accomplished this through our traditional standard new application process, which of course, as many of you know, requires hundreds and hundreds of pages of paper. We've never had, I think, the legal opportunities as we do now to look at changing that system and making it more efficient and more effective for our overall authorizing needs. And as you see, we predict that the number of replicators proportionate to our overall portfolio is going to continue to increase. And so we certainly have a need to develop these, and which is, of course, why we're all here today. We have, as I said, used our traditional process. The same exact application has been submitted with pages and pages of curriculum frameworks that we've seen before, pages and pages of program description that we've seen before in many cases. It's the same approval timeline that a brand new school who was recommended for approval experiences. And largely the same review process, but I must note that we have tweaked some things as a result of some of our experiences. For example, our standard protocol is to send applications to an external panel of reviewers from across the country. We found that to be very valuable over the years. For replicators, we typically do not do that. We typically, while we have all the paper, don't take as deep of a dive with the academic program review. And we will consider, of course, academic performance to date of the applicant. So we look at it slightly different, I must say, and that was really a reaction to our experiences and the need not to do the same types of things. So we have tweaked some things over time. One of the biggest things that we have done differently in the most current round, in which we just recently approved 12 new schools in response to our January RFP, is we've asked, in that, I believe 8 of those 12 were replicators. And it's a standard process, but in part of the review process, instead of conducting a traditional interview of the group, we've asked the CMOs to put together a business plan presentation. We've learned a lot from that. I think there are some things we didn't ask for that we probably would. But I think it was very insightful in really framing it to the applicant group, the network, the CMO, and things that we were interested in hearing about, many of which have been discussed today, particularly around the organizational growth patterns and strategies. Or do they see themselves going to 40 schools? They see themselves stopping at 4 schools, and we really see a variety of different structures out there. I think one of the things we're struggling the most is on the human capacity. What are the indicators of human capacity, teacher development, leader development, that will give us the confidence that they are ready to grow? I think we could probably all agree that it's not a numeric formula when it comes to human capacity, but we struggle with what are the best indicators of human capacity. And so moving into both our past practices as well as demand, we have experienced a lot of demand for more high quality seats for kids in New York City and across New York State. There are thousands of students on wait lists and that don't get selected in lotteries. And we feel compelled that many of those kids need higher quality seats. We also have a lot of very ambitious CMOs and independent groups that want to replicate. There's certainly a demand. We also have 120 approximately charters yet to award based on both 6 remaining from the old cap as well as a bunch, as you know, from the new legislation. And so these are all reasons to kind of rethink what we're doing with replications and how we consider them when they come in the door. There, as Ralph had noted, all kinds of advantages and possibilities around multi-site in the legislation. Another reason to kind of rethink what we're doing, as well as some federal focus on charter schools as turnaround options that we might consider within the context of multi-site and replication. So now, kind of moving into one of the things that I think the most of the conversation is focused on, which is what determines a track record of success academically to give us confidence that a group is ready to replicate. We started by looking at what are we doing with the measures we already have in our accountability plans, and how do those stack up, and how can we use those. But before I go into what we call effect size, I'd like to just kind of frame this in a sense that we consider this a minimum threshold, and one in which would, if an applicant or a replicating group met, would be eligible to apply. This isn't the full criteria, you meet this criteria, you get everything you want. But the first question I think to ask is, should there be a minimum eligibility requirement? Should you have that, what some may consider a barrier? Or should anybody be eligible to make their case for replication? So that's kind of the first question. But if we think that it is advantageous and worthy to put a minimum performance criteria in place, what should it be? One metric that we have played around with and we think has some merit, but certainly has some limitations, as we'll discuss, is what we call effect size. Effect size is a metric that compares schools to similar schools statewide, public schools, traditional public schools and charter schools alike, based on the free lunch percentage. And if a school is performing at 0.00 effect size in either ELA or mathematics, essentially they're performing as predicted, which we want to see them do better. Our accountability plan goal is 0.3 effect size in both ELA and math, which is a meaningful improvement compared to similar schools statewide. So what we'd like to say is they're effectively reducing and closing the achievement gap as it relates to poverty. This has been useful, particularly when cut scores at the state level are fluctuating and whatnot, in that it is a relative measure and it compares schools to other schools statewide. Some of the questions that we have considered, and I'm sure there are many more, and this is based on the state's grades 3 to 8 testing programs. It does not take into, obviously, account high school. That's one of the clear limitations. And I think particularly tomorrow's work group on applications will be insightful to discuss and debate some of the measures that are applicable or relevant to high school programs. So first, is this a fair metric? It's a static metric. It's not a growth metric. It's one that's relative to similar schools. I think there's we feel that it's a valid measure, but is it the right one? One of the biggest things that we've kind of chewed on is how many years at a particular level should a group have to demonstrate in order to be considered for application. And we constantly balance this, wanting to maintain quality and rigor, but we don't want to be overly restrictive of groups that could, in fact, create more high-quality seats for students. And that's a difficult balance. We found that to be a very difficult balance, and one in which we're excited to hear your thoughts on. This, probably in line with that, the most difficult challenge is how do you consider a group of 14 schools, or a group with 14 current schools, versus Paul's group or Maryland's that has a single school. It's a lot easier, I think we'd all agree, to apply a standard to a single school than to a group of schools because of the complexity that they present. We also are interested in hearing your thoughts around elementary schools that don't yet have 3 to 8 testing data, and if an authorizer should consider that data in making a case for replication. Again, balancing this quality and rigor with not being overly restrictive. Some of my colleagues now might chuckle because the scatter plots that we've been messing around with for quite some months and has become dear to my heart are about to be on the screen. Anybody that looks at academic performance I know loves a scatter plot. What this does is it plots the effect size of the schools currently authorized by SUNY that have 3 to 8 testing and this is last year's, the 2009-2010 scores. I would love to put this year's scores if our colleagues from SCD could give us the scores, that'd be great.
They're holding them out just from you, Jason. They've given them to everyone else.
So on the horizontal axis is English language arts performance. So every school is above the line. I'm sorry, it's mathematics. Every school that's above the axis is performing at a positive effect size. And so you see in mathematics, our portfolio of schools is doing very well. Above the dotted line is reaching a 0.3, which is our accountability plan goal. And so you see the vast majority of our schools are performing at their stated or above accountability plan goal in mathematics. English language arts, as I think many of us know, has been a bigger struggle for schools statewide, including the schools that we authorize. All the schools to the right of the main axis are performing better than similar schools statewide in English language arts, and those to the right of the dotted line are achieving their 0.3 effect size. What we're really looking at is schools in the upper right-hand quadrant. And we always say that whatever the metric is, if it's a scatter plot, we want those schools all to be up there in the upper right, which certainly demonstrates, according to this metric, success. And so we found it interesting to start with, using this metric, to apply just 1 year of our schools on this metric. But clearly, I think many would suggest that 1 year is not a track record. And so, is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? Can 1 year in between be below or above? So we then plotted all charter schools statewide. This, admittedly, is a very busy slide. What we had done is added additional performance bands in addition to the 0.3. So the 0.3 is in red now. The additional bands are essentially to further separate performance bands of schools, but we also plotted the schools that were authorized by the Buffalo Board of Education, the State Education Department, and the New York City Department of Education, and separated them out in that way. And so we still find quite a distribution of schools performing better than and not as well as similar schools statewide. Again, in looking at the farthest quadrant to the upper right, that would be the schools that are performing at a 0.8 effect size or higher in both English language arts and mathematics, which is significantly better than or higher than similar schools statewide. Some things to take into context here. This is only 3 to 8 again. Schools with only a 3rd grade last year have a very smaller N size, or number of students tested. This takes into account all students tested. Probably less difficult, I should say, if you have 30 students in 3rd grade versus if you have 400 in grades 3 to 8. There are certain limitations to this measure. And so then we said, we had an idea of 3 years at a 0.3 or above in English language arts and math might be a performance level to consider. These two schools, both are in attendance here, are 2 schools that we approved to replicate to go from 1 school to 2 schools. This is Manhattan Charter School and the Family Life Academy Charter School. Both successful independent schools. They both have 3 straight years at a 0.3 effect size in both ELA and mathematics. We have obviously not implemented any of these metrics, but we feel that this certainly demonstrates a level of success of these individual schools. But again, not too difficult to look at an individual school in this way. What becomes more difficult is a group of schools. And what if a group of schools, one of the schools is not performing as well as the others? Or do we take an average in considering network performance? This is a network I think many of us know well. This is the KIP network in New York City, who has 4 middle schools currently. Those 4 middle schools, as Ralph noted, are feeding into a high school in a creative way, and they're in their 2nd year of their high school. This is an interesting way of looking at a small network, and what we would consider this network is the sub-network. It's KIPP New York City and not all KIPP schools nationwide. They're all managed by a shared services team. And when you look at the performance of this network, you see a couple of schools that are doing extremely well on this metric. You see a couple of other schools that have done pretty well, that have had some performance challenges in the most recent year. And so one theory is that if a network of schools has schools outside of your metric, maybe they should focus on those schools and not replicate. The other theory that we chewed on was perhaps we should use a weighted average to look at all the schools combined and look at it in that way. And you'll see the single plot in the middle, that weighted average. And if you use that weighted average, this network is doing very well. They are performing extremely well at around a 1.0 effect size in both ELA and math. But if you use the other theory of if they've got a school that has recently struggled, perhaps they should focus on that, then perhaps they shouldn't replicate. These are questions we don't have answers to, and we certainly would like your thoughts on. That's kind of what we've done in many respects, why we've done it, why we've had these conversations, and one idea of considering kind of a ticket to play or in the door criteria around academic performance. Want to take some questions, or do we have time? Or?
We do have time. Do you have any sort of clarifying questions for Jason?
Jason?
On the effect size, just remind those of us who don't study effect sizes day in and day out, what point is there any equivalency to closing the gap in terms of moving up grades, or are those just two different metrics? You can't give any sense of what point.
It's not and Ron, I don't know.
So again, this is a snapshot of individual years. So when you look at 3 years, it's cross-sectional. What that means is some students come into the school, some students leave the school. It's looking at 3 years. It is not a growth measure. We are limited in what we can do in New York with growth measures to the extent that while the city has a growth measure and we can use the city's growth measure for the purpose of evaluating our schools in the city, it wouldn't apply to the rest of the schools statewide, which actually raises an issue, if I may, that what we have here is a snapshot that is good to identify the relative performance of schools within the state, of SUNY and non-SUNY, as long as it's within the state, but it doesn't address schools outside, I should say, networks applying to us in New York that come from outside of New York. We don't have that available.
The other
And
thing,
then between 2007, 8, and then 9, 10, almost every line regressed towards the mean. Why?
I mean, I think if you're alluding to the cut scores changing, this is relative performance. So
No, right.
it's
So
not that.
that's what the surprise is. That almost all the lines
I think that's a great question.
Because
moved left and south.
Because the cut scores were lower and the standard was essentially raised, it became more variable than it had been before. You had so many schools near the ceiling previously that with the change in cut scores, there was this tendency to push scores down.
And I must say, with respect to the high school challenge, also balancing this, maintaining quality and rigor, but also not being overly restrictive. If we consider high school graduation, for example, to be a key metric for high schools, most high schools start in grade 9 and grow, and so it would be 4 years before they'd have a graduation rate, and perhaps if we imposed a track record of 3 years, it might be 7 years before they could demonstrate that. And I think many would argue that that's just too long when there's students in need, and that we have operators that can provide high quality high school education to those students. There are also alternative high schools that were in innovative models that we're authorizing that might not always fit into this framework, and so we're challenged to develop some criteria to apply in those cases as well. Trustee O'Brien?
I'm sure you have trustee O'Brien. Jason, forgive me, but if I heard you correctly, you just said that if it's a 3-year cycle, whether we have the data or not, we will somehow know that those high school seats are quality seats, and hence we should be authorizing? How do we know? If we do not have the data, how do we know? My answer is we don't.
I think that, I think there are leading indicators that we can look at are not as strong as high school graduation rate, and I think that that's a great question that I would pose to the group, particularly those that have high school experience, those authorizers. What are those measures at the high school level, if there are any, before the ultimate measure to give some degree of confidence around quality?
I would just respond that as someone who's been in admittedly a college classroom for 40 years, what one tries to do is look at the finish line. I mean, ultimately, that's where you want students to be. And you need to have the evidence that they got there. So, I mean, this is just one person's opinion, but we need to have the data before we proceed with authorization. Now, which data may be a different issue.
Jason, would you, is one of the considerations on a replication proposal, if there's a bad school or a low-performing school, would you simultaneously require a improvement for that? Rather than saying no replication till you fix it, would you at the same time consider, give us a plan, while we consider this new school over here, you've got this one bad one over here, give us a plan about what you're going to do to improve it. Could you marry those two?
I am gonna let Jason respond, but I just wanted to make sure that, just the way you framed the question, Peter, I want to make sure that we're all clear. We don't know the right answer to this. It's why we're here. And so, in addition to sort of Jason trying to answer that question, we would love the input from everyone else. I just want to make sure that we're not suggesting what Jason presented was all the places we got stuck in our thinking. So, go ahead, Jason.
I mean, in this, so I'll take you back to what we did in this current round with CMOs. We did actually ask them in their business plan presentation to address any perceived performance challenges that they've had. So that's, which is kind of in line with that, certainly. And, you know, I think all options, I think that's a reasonable option to consider, is, you know, asking a CMO to address those challenges that they've had, certainly. So something we're considering, yeah. Okay.
Jason, this is perhaps a legal question. Do you have the ability to require in your contractual relationship perhaps a test that as university you require your schools to take? I mean, I know funding is an issue, or you can get some pretty decent off the shelf, about $10 a head, 10, 12. Is that something you can or thought about doing, which would show growth and whatnot?
Well, I often say that while I'm not a lawyer and I do play one on TV, I think I would certainly defer to Ralph. I mean, my short answer would be, I assume we probably could, but due to a number of autonomy and resource issues, we just, and I know where you're going with this in terms of the performance series that you all use and probably find valuable. There's a number of reasons why we haven't, but I assume we probably could, but Ralph?
We could as an extra term to the charter. We haven't done it to date, and there'd be a question about who would pay for it.
And as with many, we are constrained with resources as well.
Could be the price of the ticket. That's a good point.
That's true.
We're going to transition and let Brian begin to do some facilitation of this solution possibilities, and let Jason